Hello and welcome to another WATCHPRO Originals interview. And today we're joined by Robin Swithinbank. He's a writer and editor, highly experienced in the business of luxury watches, or the luxury business in general, I should say, and writes for several titles, both sides of the Atlantic, including the New York Times, Financial Times, the Telegraph, GQ, Esquire. The list could go on. So I thought it'd be a good idea. We could have a little chat about how the media world is working in general, what he thinks of the debacle over the trade shows in Switzerland this year, and how that might change the entire sort of media and marketing landscape. But just in general, we're going to have a chat about life in lockdown, I would assume. Let's see what's happening from the brand side with their marketing. And I suppose the most interesting topic to begin with is what we've seen with Baselworld and the shift to Geneva and all those sorts of things. What do you make of all of
that? I take quite a conservative view on this, actually. I have many colleagues who are, how should we put this delicately, believe quite strongly that Baselworld has got what was coming to it. My view is slightly less volatile, perhaps. I think Baselworld has definitely made some mistakes. There's no question of that. I also think, however, that the current management were delivered the ultimate hospital pass not even 2 years ago. And since July 2018, when Mr. Loris Melikov took over the role, he has received endless bad news. And a lot of that bad news, I think, was coming his way because of what the previous management had done. And obviously, it's still MCH Group, and there's some consistency there. And one man is not going to change everything. Equally, he shouldn't be blamed for everything. But I think what I had hoped, and coronavirus has really put paid to this, is that he would be given the opportunity to turn the tanker around, if you like. And obviously, there's been a dramatic drop-off in the number of exhibitors over the last, well, going back 10 years, and he never really quite managed to stem the tide. But from my perspective, perhaps more as a journalist than, obviously I'm not trade, I'm not a consumer, I'm not even a collector. But I felt that he was making all the right noises in terms of the sort of show that he wanted to build and the offering that he wanted to present to the multiple stakeholders. And, given another year or two, and take the coronavirus out of the equation, maybe that would have been possible. I'm not saying it was possible, I'm not saying it would have happened, but I would like to have seen the industry given a bit more time. And so when the news came through a couple of weeks ago that the Rolex-led consortium was walking away, I must admit, I thought that was pretty ruthless and lacked a certain amount of sympathy. Now, I know business is business and bottom line is critical in the watch industry, just as it is in any other industry. But I think the watch industry could have played its cards more sympathetically. And I say the watch industry, I mean those big brands, the Rolexes, the Pateks, Chopard, Chanel, et al. They've sort of left Baselworld crippled. Yeah. And this is a show which is over 100 years old. And it has played an integral role in the development of the industry that you and I benefit from, and many, many others besides. And I think those brands have benefited hugely from being involved in Baselworld for such a long period of time. It has helped to oxygenate an industry. Okay, over the last 10 years, the ways in which an individual brand can oxygenate its story and its sales have changed beyond all recognition, and Baselworld should have reacted sooner than it did, and it did behave with a huge amount of arrogance. I've no doubt about that. Some of the stories I've heard about the way the press were treated, for example, by the old regime, are quite extraordinary. But it's just a shame to see something with that much heritage and, in theory, that much emotional credit in the bank being swept to one side, almost not without regard for it. And I don't want to make these brands out to be total bar stewards, but I think it could have been handled more delicately, particularly given the current climate.
Well, I mean, I think you and I have both interviewed Mr. Loris Melikov, and I've certainly found him to be smart and generous and not arrogant in the slightest. In fact, probably the very opposite of arrogant. So I do think that the I fear that it was probably somewhere higher up in MCH Group where it was decided that they weren't even going to repay the deposits, or try to lock people in for 2021.
Yeah, maybe, but at the same time, Baselworld has incurred cost this year. It can't simply give back 100% of what it's taken. It was a show that was already suffering. It lost money last year, as Mr. Loris Melikov told me when I met with him, which I'm not sure the previous regime would have admitted to, for that matter. It's still a business. It's still it was still a going concern, with overheads. One of which was, of course, they were planning to launch this digital platform, as Watches and Wonders has just done in the last week. Now, whether or not that actually happens now is another matter. But I mean, I've worked for creative agencies in my time, and I know that these things cost brands, cost businesses a huge amount of money to develop. And they've already invested a huge amount of money in the development of that platform, which may now never see the light of day. And there's a cost to that. And the brands who would have been involved in that platform, whose stories would have been told through it, would have benefited from it. I'm not saying that Baselworld.com, or whatever they would have called it, would have become the world's most important watch website. It may never have competed with your own website, or with Hodinkee, or with the brand's websites themselves. But I think it would have become, it had the potential to become an important part of the story. Some of the devices that I think Mr. Loris Melikov was planning to integrate into the site, as sort of a LinkedIn for the watch industry, he once said. I don't know whether that was still part of it as the plans had matured, but that, I think, was unlikely to have had any great impact on the industry. But suck it and see, why not try it? And I think that was one of many things which would have cost Baselworld money this year. And so asking the brands if they could retain some of the fee wasn't entirely unreasonable in my book.
Yeah, but if you say to them that you can't cancel, or you lose your deposit, I don't know, the whole thing felt mishandled. The scary thing about the exhibition business is that you spend 365 days a year working on something that only goes on for a week, and for most of those 365 days, all you've got to do is maintain good relationships with everybody, so that it doesn't go pear-shaped. Now they're going to be far more skilled at running exhibitions than I ever could be, but I feel that they made mistakes at the end. Maybe it was inevitable anyway. Maybe coronavirus was always going to do this. Maybe the brands were always looking for a way out, or a way to move to Geneva or something.
I think that's certainly how it feels to Baselworld at the moment.
But don't give them such an easy excuse to do it.
No, agreed. And I mean, the ins and outs of the timing, moving it to January, are a little opaque. I've not managed to get to the bottom of exactly who said what and when, and who had heard what and when. But clearly the brands who were leaving felt that the decision to postpone to January had been taken without the necessary consultation, whereas according to the press release that Baselworld released, that consultation had taken place. So it's a little bit difficult for us sometimes to kind of navigate through what did happen, what didn't happen.
Yeah, I'd find it pretty hard to believe that the brands didn't know about the January date, but
quite. And equally, I mean, there were many cries of how incredibly and impossibly late the shows were going to be this year. And I suspect that Baselworld thought, wow, this has given us an opportunity to reposition the fair at the beginning of the year. And then apparently that's not right either. So very difficult, very difficult. And I don't think it's a case of one party being entirely right and another being entirely wrong. Clearly there's an enormous grey area here. But for me, personally, I was just very disappointed to see the industry really drag its reputation through the gutter quite publicly a couple of weeks ago, and behave in a way that I didn't think was entirely in keeping with the industry that I've known for the last 15 years. Maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm entirely naive, but I think the industry has done a very good job of presenting itself as being considerate and well-mannered, and the product that it presents is of a sort of higher moral caliber in some ways, or at least it would like us to believe that it is. That's certainly the way it sells itself, and yet we saw it behaving in a slightly lower way a couple of weeks ago, and that was a shame to see.
Yeah, well, we don't get to see the inner workings or inner emotions of Rolex very often, but that letter that they sent was dynamite.
Yes, and maybe that's why Rolex doesn't communicate with the outside world very often, because when it does, it ruffles a few feathers. I mean, it remains a hugely powerful brand, and there's no doubt that Rolex, and in fact I've been saying this for a number of years now, that the Rolexes of the world, the Pateks, the seven businesses, the seven watch businesses, which are turning over more than £1 billion Swiss francs a year, I've got no doubt that they can continue to sustain their business model without a watch fair. But at the same time, I think a watch fair does a huge amount to oxygenate the entire industry, to create core temperature, to give it momentum, which no one brand can have by itself. And I know I'm not alone in thinking that. I've spoken to probably dozens of CEOs over the last couple of years about this. And even those who have pulled out are aware of the value of a watch fair. I spoke to Georges Kern this morning, and he said exactly that. And he hasn't made any commitments and wasn't prepared to say on the record whether he's committed to going to Geneva next April. But I'd be absolutely astonished if Breitling wasn't represented in some way in Geneva next year, because the world's attention, certainly the industry's attention, will be turned to Geneva for that period. And any smart brand will want to be a part of that. You have to look at a brand like, let's take Maurice Lacroix as an example. Maurice Lacroix pulled out of Baselworld for 2019. This year it was due to come back. Why? I'm sure they'll have all sorts of reasons, but one of them will be because they missed out. That their brand was probably deoxygenated by not being part of the show. I don't know about you, but I had invitations from that brand to go and visit them during both SIHH and Baselworld last year, off-site, away from the action. Yeah. And I'm afraid it wasn't a big enough brand to pull my attentions away from the core activity I'd been invited to. And that's a perfect example for me of how most brands need a watch fair in order to get the attention and the coverage, and also the activity with retailers and customers and collectors and every possible stakeholder. They need to be involved in a fair.
I absolutely agree that I think the Swiss watch industry, in fact the global watch industry, because I think we should include the Japanese in this, would be very much the poor without a huge show. But it was fragmenting ever since Swatch Group pulled out, Breitling pulled out. You know, we last year and even this year, you and I were being invited all over the world to all sorts of different things. Retailers were the same. It was, it was way too much travel. It was way too fragmented, and it had to be pulled back together somehow. And the question mark then was, would it be pulled back together in Basel, or would it be pulled back together in Geneva? And Basel as a city has some inherent disadvantages. A weak hand to play in the first place, and the city itself played that hand incredibly badly, and contributed to pushing everybody towards Geneva, where I'm sure we're going to find lots of hotels and restaurants gouging us there as well. But at least it's better set up for more people.
Geneva was hardly cheap in the first place. I suppose the difference being that, and I suspect this is pretty widely known, that speaking on behalf of the press, we get invited to go to SIHH and we are put up in a hotel. That comes with compromises perhaps, but it's very expensive to go and stay in Geneva. And speaking as a freelancer, someone's going to put me up in a hotel for a few days. I'm going to find that very difficult to turn down. Baselworld, on the other hand, obviously we had to pay our way a lot more. They offered some nights on a boat and so on, so it wasn't as expensive as it might have been for the entirety of the press corps. But both cities are wildly expensive. Switzerland's one of the most expensive countries to visit in the world. So I don't think either city is going to sort of get off lightly in that respect, or at least leave us in a position where we come away from the show saying, wow, that was incredibly good value, wasn't it? We must go again. But I agree, Basel itself didn't play its hand at all well. And when you're paying a couple of hundred Swiss francs for a taxi from the airport into the centre of town, and being fleeced left, right and centre for food and so on, it makes it very, very difficult to justify going, particularly if you're a retail team or if you're an editorial team, you end up just cutting back and sending fewer and fewer people.
Yeah.
So yes, the trajectory ultimately was poor and something needed to be done. But again, I'm going back to Mr. Loris Melikov, and when I sat down and interviewed him last April, he talked passionately about this sort of travel service that he was planning to build, and which he had sort of soft launched, I think, last November, whereby he sort of held the city to account and became a de facto travel agent by buying hotel rooms and the like en masse in order to sell them to visitors to the fair for a better price. Now, I didn't get as far as actually engaging with that service to discover whether or not he had actually been able to deliver any benefits, any price advantages. But at least the idea was there, at least the recognition from the show was there that Basel itself, the city, was ripping people off. Mm. And he said to me at the time, and it's not like people are coming to Basel in March or April or whenever the fair is held because Basel is the best place in the world to be in March and April. They're coming because of my show. Yeah. And I can't have them ripping off my customers. But I just don't think that sort of maybe there hasn't been enough evidence, practically, literally, tangibly, for people to recognise that was the ambition, or that is the ambition. We keep talking in the past tense about Baselworld. Technically, it's still alive, but that was the ambition of the current management. And as I said earlier, I think it's disappointing they've not had the opportunity to really play their hand fully and to try and restore what was a creaking machine.
And we haven't yet seen what Geneva is going to deliver. We have to remind ourselves that so far, Geneva has only ever put on a show for 30 brands, most of the Richemont brands, and then maybe a dozen or so artisan independents at SIHH. But they did have big plans for this year to involve the whole city. And I spoke to Fabian Lupo, who's organising, the organiser of SIHH and Watches and Wonders, as it's called now. And this idea that the whole city gets involved, where retailers are doing, some beautiful, amazing retailers, Les Ambassadeurs, Bouquerat in the centre of Geneva, plus the mono brands owned by the watch brands, plus the city itself. It really could turn into a bit of a carnival for the Swiss watch industry, and hopefully the Japanese and the Germans as well. And that's something that, try as they might, Basel was never really going to pull off as a city. So even though I was always a big fan of Basel, would remain a big fan of Baselworld, I think what I'm really a big fan of is a big event that kicks off the entire year, as you say, oxygenates the entire industry. And I can't help feeling that Geneva is the place for that to happen.
No, you may well be right. And I think, there are a couple of ironies here. Well, one is that Baselworld itself had been talking about federating, maybe behind the scenes, not necessarily publicly. And again, I go back to the conversation I had with Mr. Loris Melikov last April, where he was sort of flummoxed, really, by the inability of the industry to collaborate and federate better. All he could see were divisions, and those divisions seemed to be getting bigger as time went by, as the Swatch groups of this world pulled out. I think he is, of course, a non-watch industry person by background, and he came in, again, perhaps naively, looking at the landscape and thinking, surely we must be able to make this better. It would be ironic if the watch industry ended up federating around an event in Geneva at the expense of Baselworld, which was the body which had been most public, certainly in my experience, about federating in the first place. So that's a sort of a fairly sad irony. The second is, of course, that I think we would all agree that yes, one fair would be better. And in fact, if we end up in Geneva next year and all the big players are there with all the sort of secondary and tertiary brands in attendance as well, great, what a fantastic result. But I go back to what I was saying earlier, that I think it would be, I think it's a great shame that we might end up with the right result in really the wrong way, in a way that leaves a rather sour taste in the mouth.
And we can't be certain yet that we are going to end up with that. I mean, at the moment we have, well, assuming the current 30 brands of Watches and Wonders stick, then we got 5 more. That's 35 brands, when Baselworld at its pomp was 1,500 brands. And even last year, it was 600 brands or something. So, you mentioned those secondary and tertiary brands. There's the jewellery industry, there's the equipment industry, there's the gems industry. Are all of those going to end up in Geneva? I doubt it. But would they stick around in Basel without Rolex and Patek and, that great magnetic draw? Hard to see that as well. But so there's a lot to play for as we sit here today.
There is, and I don't pretend to be able to look into a crystal ball and predict exactly what's going to happen. And if I'm honest, my understanding of the jewellery and gem industries and those others besides that were represented at Baselworld is insufficient to comment with any real authority on how they might behave. My sort of view of Baselworld tended to be through Hall 1 first and foremost, where all the major watch brands were gathered. But there are still some big question marks out there, absolutely. And I think, as I said just now, we should be careful perhaps talking about Baselworld in the past tense, because it may be that there is something that can be rescued from the remnants of what is left, and it may yet survive and thrive in becoming something entirely different. I don't know. I hope for the sake of those whose livelihoods are affected that there is a positive outcome. But I suspect, as far as the sort of core watch industry is concerned, and where those big watch brand players are concerned, Geneva is now the future, without question. And I think we should also remember that brands like Seiko, have said that they pulled out of this year's fair because it was their 60th anniversary and they wanted to do something that was very much Japanese centric. And so they had planned, as I think both you and I were invited to go out there at the beginning of March to be introduced to their 60th anniversary collections, the Grand Seiko collections, and enjoy their hospitality out there rather than in Basel. And I don't think they'd ever said, we are never coming back. Certainly the view I had from when I spoke to Seiko last week was that they would certainly have considered returning to Basel next year. Who knows what they'll end up doing therefore in 2021. Whether or not we'll even be allowed to have a fair if the world has recovered sufficiently for us all to gather in such numbers, we of course can't be certain at this point.
Yeah, well, let's talk about three hypothetical scenarios, and I know we don't have a crystal ball, but we do have experience of these things. There have broadly speaking been three ways in which the industry could move forward. We could see a situation where they've absolutely loved what's been going on in lockdown, and they're doing everything by webcast and websites and Instagram interviews and all that sort of thing. We could have a fragmented industry where LVMH and Swatch Group and Richemont and the others go their separate ways, and we're left trawling around Japan and Dubai and all these other places. Or we could have a consolidated show in Switzerland, or a combination of all three, obviously. Combination of all three. But what's been your preference down the years, and what have you made of the digital launches so far this year?
My preference in terms of which of those three hypothetical scenarios we'd end up with, I think, first of all, yes, a consolidated fair, I think, would be very good for the industry. And I think personally speaking, it would be very efficient for our trade, the journalists amongst us, to have one destination, 1 week, where the vast majority of the year's stories are presented to us. That's an efficient way for us to do the business, and it probably is for, certainly, if we're talking about a Geneva-based event, for the Europeans, that is obviously hugely efficient. I think the reality is, though, that the fragmentation that we've seen is likely to continue. Now, whether that means that brands, whether that be Audemars Piguet or Breitling or Richard Mille or Swatch Group or any of these others who have so far walked away from one of the major fairs, whether that means they'll be doing their own events, or whether it means Watches and Wonders, as the sort of preeminent example all of a sudden, will be hosting multiple events around the world during the calendar, I'm not yet sure. I suspect there will be at least 3 iterations of Watches and Wonders next year, global pandemic allowing. February, there's already a Miami event scheduled. They're obviously now talking about the end of April next year being the Geneva event. And then in their press release, they talked about, I can't remember the exact expression now, but it certainly pointed to more than 2 events. So I suspect there'll be an event in the Far East as well.
They talked about an event in Asia, so I don't know if...
There used to be Watches and Wonders in Hong Kong,
yeah.
And obviously that's been a fairly tricky environment to go into for the last couple of years. And so firstly for financial, and then more recently because of civil unrest in the country, it's been a difficult place to go into. But I suspect that will recover. And if it doesn't, then they'll find somewhere else in the Far East to set up shop. And I think that would be healthy. That would make much more sense in a world where I think people are going to travel a lot less. And when they do travel, they probably won't want to travel quite as far or for as long. And so having a 3-strand or 4-strand event strategy would make a lot of sense. And I think the brands want that as well. I mean, I suspect you've spoken to multiple brands as well. And when you ask the CEOs exactly what sort of structure they'd like to see in the future, they're not looking just at one consolidated solution. They are looking at a multifaceted solution that enables them to talk to the many different audiences that they have in using the many different platforms that they have. So I think fragmentation is inevitable and also very positive, but I think it has to be addressed in the right way. And when I say that, I mean in such a way that the core temperature is not lost. The industry can operate as a unit too, because it's more powerful. It's better together, to use an expression that will be very familiar to British listeners.
Yeah. I mean, what have you made about the digital launches? I'll go first, because I've been left rather cold by them, I've got to say. You know, sitting through webcasts and tuning into watchesandwonders.com on Saturday and everything. I mean, it didn't feel a lot different to the sort of stuff that is usually, just the added extras on the side of the real event. I think I did a review of the Breitling Web Summit and said, you know, the sort of videos that we're being shown that's where us journalists tend to go and check our emails when those videos are on, and yet that's all we've got now.
Don't know what you mean, Rob.
Yeah, so it doesn't feel like they've cracked it this year, although I have kind of enjoyed the fact that a lot more CEOs have been out there doing online interviews and
with varying degrees of success, of course. I think I have two thoughts on that. I was, as I said, I was talking to Georges Kern this morning, and of course he did his Web Summit 10 days ago, and he's claiming that hundreds of thousands of people tuned into it, and I'm sure, a bit like you were saying earlier, hundreds of thousands, a high percentage of those may well have been consumers. He didn't know. I think that's still too early. They're still trying to consolidate the numbers, but at the same time, he said there is no substitute for the physical. On two levels. One is the relational element. You know, the industry needs to meet so that relationships can be built and networks can be strengthened. And that doesn't matter whether you're in retail or whether you're a brand or whether you're a consumer or, of course, whether you're a member of the press. That's a really important facet of the fairs, and no amount of webcasts can replicate that. And the second is that, of course, it's a tangible product. And for me, regardless of how thorough the digital content we're offered is, it will never, ever replicate the physical experience of holding a watch and sticking it on your wrist. And so the latter is not going to replace the former, certainly. I mean, a bit like with digital and print, the two exist or should exist in a complementary way. In terms of the digital products that have come through themselves, and obviously Watches and Wonders being the big one, it's a website with a load of content on it. Has it been brilliantly presented? I found it quite difficult to navigate so far, if I'm perfectly honest. Is it innovative? I think this is the word. This is probably where this is the crux of the issue in a way, isn't it? I mean, yes, the situation we're in is predicated by the fact that we're all on lockdown and can't travel to either Basel or Geneva to see any watches. But behind it all, there is this frequently discussed issue on innovation. Are we becoming more innovative in the way that we make our products, in the way that we present our products, in the way that we tell our stories, and in the way that we communicate with our audience? And for me, there's been nothing hugely innovative about it. I don't have a solution. I'm not saying that I have a better and more innovative solution to the way that the products have been presented over the course of the last few weeks. I think that the problem is more that in the absence of an opportunity to gather physically, there's nothing that serves as a valuable substitute. Or as a total substitute, maybe I should say. It's a valuable substitute, but it's not. It doesn't make up for the absence of meeting.
I guess, and we'll end back in our world a little bit, in journalism and media and what have you. There's obviously been a dramatic drop off in advertising revenue. I don't mind admitting that that's been pretty tough for WATCHPRO, but we've managed to get through without layoffs, and we've still getting my daily news out every day, working from home.
Vital WATCHPRO newsletter, absolutely. Where would we be without you, Rob?
Well, exactly. I mean, and you said, there's nothing innovative about it, but it's just a sort of execution issue. Sometimes with these things, in fact, it's a pretty ugly news alert and not a very pretty website either. But I think people, come.
Beauty isn't the eye of the beholder.
Well, exactly. But it does feel a bit like the acceleration away from print and towards digital will gather pace through this, and different types of content on different platforms will increase. And I think the big media companies, the newspaper groups, the magazine groups, the TV broadcasters, even need to get their act together about being as cross-platform as they can possibly be. You've got to be across social, you've got to be across web, you've got to be across video, you've got to be across pretty much everything. And what I find is that leaves me very little time just as an editor to do the print thing anymore. And I would almost rather that the print thing went away, because I think, I know that the content that I'm putting out digitally is stronger, really, or complementary in a way to what's going out in print, but it's, WatchPro is known for being the first with the news and that sort of thing, and that's not what happens with a monthly magazine that needs to takes a week to print and distribute.
Well, print has relevance when it has longevity, and I suppose my own personal experience of that over the last few years is in trying to build a brand around something called the Jackal, which I hope you remember. I hope it made some impression. And we were producing 100,000 copies of a magazine 6 times a year. And the intention behind that print product was always that people should hang on to it. It was never intended to be disposable. We were never trying to deliver news that people had to hear in that particular instant, because, of course, the lead time between press and go and the thing actually landing was about 2 weeks. So it was never intended to be a sort of a news vehicle. And so I think print continues to work when it is offered as an indulgence rather than as a source of information that you need to know right now. I mean, your magazine in a way is a good example. In fact, I can see a copy of your latest on the floor here. Sorry, on the floor, on my desk, I should say.
Tucked under your pillow, perhaps. Or...
Yeah. But if I'm honest, that arrived at the end of last week and I haven't opened it, but I have clicked on your email every day in between time, because it's more immediate and it's within the device that I'm already working on. And at some point I will carve out some time to flick through the magazine as well. So print works well, I think, when it has the right content and is produced in the right way for the right audience. And I still write for a number of print titles that I think continue to be hugely effective because of the approach that they take to their content.
And finally, are you finding it okay as a freelancer at the moment? It feels like there's, perhaps more watch journalists than required around the world at the moment.
Wasn't there always?
Well, perhaps, yeah.
Yes, we're hardly at the front line, are we? To be honest with you, mostly yes so far. Although I think I think a lot of us are feeling that we're doing probably 150% of the work for 50% of the income at the moment. But I feel slightly churlish in suggesting that might even be worthy of any sort of sympathy, because it's great to have something to do, and I am fortunate to be working in an industry that is that actually was in pretty rude health before all this kicked off, and remains optimistic about its potential once this period has passed. And I work for a number of titles who continue to have some sort of platform to launch content into the world from. The New York Times, I suppose, being a paramount example. And their model, of course, is largely subscription based these days, and people are not cancelling their subscriptions at the moment, while advertisers are cancelling their advertising. So, yeah, not too bad is the honest answer, and I feel very fortunate to be in that position.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. Always good to see you. Hopefully, we'll be together again soon and having a couple of beers.
That'd be nice. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.